not that I necessarily think that Tiny Tim should have asked for a jet ski, but maybe Tiny Tim should have asked for a jet ski. Welcome back, friends. I'm Annabelle, and I'm here to read. Every week, first we read a piece of classic literature together, and then we talk about it. If you would like to follow along, down in the video description box, along with some source links and a link to the author's biography, there is a copy of a free ebook. While you're down there, you might want to subscribe, just in case. This week, we are reading The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. Most terribly cold it was. It snowed, and was nearly quite dark, and evening, the last evening of the year. In this cold and darkness, there went along the street a poor little girl, bareheaded and with naked feet. When she left home, she had slippers on, it is true, but what was the good of that? They were very large slippers, which her mother had hitherto worn, so large were they, and the poor little thing lost them as she scuffled away across the street because of two carriages that rolled by dreadfully fast. One slipper was nowhere to be found. The other had been laid hold of by an urchin, and off he ran with it. He thought it would do capitally for a cradle when he some day or other should have children himself. So the little maiden walked on with her tiny, naked feet that were quite red and blue from cold. She carried a quantity of matches in an old apron, and she held a bundle of them in her hand. Nobody had bought anything of her the whole livelong day. No one had given her a single farthing. She crept along trembling with cold and hunger, a very picture of sorrow, the poor little thing. The flakes of snow covered her long, fair hair, which fell in beautiful curls around her neck. But of that, of course, she never once now thought. From all the windows the candles were gleaming, and it smelt so deliciously of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve. Yes, of that she thought. In a corner formed by two houses, of which one advanced more than the other, she seated herself down and cowered together. Her little feet she had drawn close up to her, but she grew colder, and to go home she did not venture, for she had not sold any matches, and could not bring a farthing of money. From her father she would certainly get blows, and at home it was cold too, for above her she had only the roof, through which the wind whistled, even though the largest cracks were stopped up with straw and rags. Her little hands were almost numbed with cold. A match might afford her a world of comfort, if she only dared take a single one out of the bundle, draw it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. She drew one out. Wretched. How it blazed, how it burned! It was a warm, bright flame like a candle, as she held her hands over it. It was a wonderful light. It seemed really to the little maiden as though she were sitting before a large iron stove with burnished brass feet and a brass ornament atop. The fire burned with such blessed influence. It warmed so delightfully. The little girl had already stretched out her feet to warm them too, but the small flame went out. The stove vanished. She had only the remains of the burnt-out match in her hand. She rubbed another against the wall. It burned brightly, and where the light fell on the wall, there the wall became transparent like a veil, so that she could see into the room. On the table was spread a snow-white tablecloth. Upon it was a splendid porcelain service, and the roast goose was steaming famously with its stuffing of apple and dried plums. And what was still more capital to behold was the goose, hopped down from the dish, reeled about on the floor with knife and fork in its breast, till it came up to the poor little girl, when, the match went out, and nothing but the thick, cold, damp wall was left behind. She lighted another match. Now there she was, sitting under the most magnificent Christmas tree. It was still larger and more decorated than the one which she had seen through the glass door in the rich merchant's house. Thousands of lights were burning on in the green branches, and gaily colored pictures, such as she had seen in the shop windows, looked down upon her. The little maiden stretched out her hands toward them when the match went out. The lights of the Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them now as stars in heaven, when fell down and formed a long trail of fire. "Someone is just dead," said the little girl, for her old grandmother, the only person who had loved her and who was now no more, had told her that when a star falls, a soul ascends to God. She drew another match against the wall. It was again light, and in the luster there stood the old grandmother, so bright and radiant, so mild, and with such an expression of love. "Grandmother," cried the little one, "oh, take me with you. You go away when the match burns out. You vanish like the warm stove, like the delicious roast goose and the magnificent Christmas tree." And she rubbed the whole bundle of matches quickly against the wall, for she wanted to be quite sure of keeping her grandmother near her. And the matches gave such a brilliant light that it was brighter than noonday. Never formerly had the grandmother been so beautiful and so tall. She took the little maiden on her arm, and both flew in brightness and in joy so high, so very high, and then above was neither cold, nor hunger, nor anxiety. They were with God. But in the corner, at the cold hour of dawn, sat the poor girl with rosy cheeks and with a smiling mouth, leaning against the wall, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and stark sat the child there with her matches, of which one bundle had been burnt. She wanted to warm herself, people said. No one had the slightest suspicion of what beautiful things she had seen. No one even dreamed of the splendor in which, with her grandmother, she had entered on the joys of a new year. The end. The Little Match Girl was initially published in 1845, and then it was published again in Dansk Folkekalender in 1846. Hope you don't mind, I looked at my notes for that one. Dickens was this, among the pantheon of the literary blah blah blah, and he was incredibly popular in his time, and he was wealthy, and everybody knew him, and he wrote all this stuff, and everyone was like, "Oh, Charles Dickens, we love your stuff!" And Hans Christian Andersen was also writing at the time, and they were sort of friends, because Dickens invited Andersen to come and, stay with him at one point, and then Andersen overstayed his welcome by 5 weeks. I don't want to say that Andersen was obsessed with Dickens. He clearly looked up to Dickens and thought of him as being an influence. And when you start to think about that, pulling the threads between the Dickens Christmas stories and Hans Christian Andersen and this particular Christmas story, you can kind of see the parallel between Tiny Tim and the Little Match Girl. It's very much the same story, except Tiny Tim is somewhat humanized. He has a name and a happy ending. He has family and friends that love him. And the Little Match Girl, not only do they not have that, well, it kind of sucks that we're poor, but at least we have that family togetherness. And the last person that loved her was her grandmother, who's dead. And Little Match Girl was actually published 2 years after A Christmas Carol. So, it's not like they were bouncing ideas off each other and we just kind of came up with similar themes at the same... No. And this particular theme, not to editorialize too much or whatever, But I have always really disliked this particular theme in Christmas media in specific, where there is some child who's poor, and like not just like piteous, like, oh, that poor kid, but like literally like money, they have no money, they're poor, unwealthy children who have a conflict which can be very easily solved by just giving that child money. It's seen as somehow more pure and honest and whatever that these kids are broke. It's not the kids' fault that they're poor. Like, it's so weird. We see this theme pop up very, very frequently in Christmas media. The most resounding example of this to me is the song about the Christmas shoes that plays every year. And in this particular era, it was this idea of how it's somehow more honest and it brings you closer to God to suffer and all that kind of thing. But we continue to see it now, even though that isn't really a thing for us anymore societally, that suffering is good. Like, there is the struggle, but you struggle the struggle so you can come out the other side and be wealthy. That's just always kind of been a theme throughout a lot of religious stuff, is that suffering is divine. And the parable, or what is it, an axiom? The line of scripture that says that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. So I guess there's kind of always been this idea that creature comforts on earth are somehow bad. And the little match girls and the Tiny Tim and the poor kid with the Christmas shoes, those characters / people are somehow more humanized and more divine than the rest of us because, oh, we're gonna hang out with our nice comfy blankets and our candles and but that kid is gonna see heaven and I'm not, so who's really living in luxury now? And it always really struck me that the things that the kids want are very like, they're not asking for, gold-plated elephants or whatever, they're not asking for the moon. They're asking for like, I wish I could have these shoes for my mama. It's not a lofty, like, rich people thing. They're not asking for yachts. Like, not that I necessarily think that Tiny Tim should have asked for a jet ski, but maybe Tiny Tim should have asked for a jet ski. But I kind of wonder if this theme is along the same lines as that same corny joke that I make every time I talk about, the early feminist writers, where it's not so much that they're, striving for exact equality or whatever. They're just trying to throw a light on the fact that women are people too, and they have thoughts and desires and things that can be diverse and weird and interesting. And I kind of wonder if it's the same idea here. Like, poor kids are people too, and they kind of want to, live their little tiny urchin lives. I don't fully understand why this story is popular. Like, I honestly don't. This is one of those, like, it's Christmas, and at Christmas you tell the truth, and I don't really like that movie either, but we're focusing on Little Match Girl for right now. But I don't quite understand why this resonates with people in such a way that this continues to be popular at this point in time. I understand why certain pieces of media have become popular. Some of it is because it's in the public domain, so people can just have a production of the Christmas Carol and not have to pay any rights to MTI or whoever's doing rights these days. But Little Match Girl, I don't... Like, Tiny Tim is right there. You don't need both Tiny Tim and Little Match Girl unless you're just reading media to feel sad at Christmas. Now that I say that, my personal favorite Christmas Carol is Judy Garland's version of Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. So...
Have yourself a merry little Christmas.
I just really like Judy Garland. So what is your opinion of the little match girl? I don't even know that I want to ask. So if you have an opinion on this story and I didn't just completely scare you off, go talk to me about it down in the comments, because I'm sure that one of you has an opinion that will steer me right on this one. And while you're down there, I'm sure that because you like Little Match Girl, you want to subscribe so that, I can ruin something else for you a little bit later. I'll see you next time.